No one talks about what the ground remembers. The earth beneath the old Henderson Plantation in Macon County, Georgia, held secrets that most folks preferred to leave undisturbed. By 1871, 6 years after the war's end, the land had changed hands twice. The cotton fields had grown wild in places, and the main house stood with half its windows boarded up. But something about that particular stretch of red clay soil troubled the men who worked it. Tools would strike hollow spaces where there should have been none. Strange echoes came from beneath their feet when the rain fell hard. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the mist hung low over the fields, they swore they could hear sounds rising from the earth itself, sounds that had no business being there. Then, on a humid September morning, they found the boy. He was alive. He had been under the ground for 9 days, and what he'd survived down there in the darkness would haunt Macon County for generations to come. The discovery happened because of a stubborn mule named Jasper. The animal had been pulling a plow across the southeastern field when it stopped dead, refusing to move despite the curses and coaxing of its handler, a freedman named Tobias Wright. Jasper's ears went flat against his head, and he stamped the ground 3 times with his front hoof, the way animals do when they sense something profoundly wrong. Tobias had worked this land for nearly a year since Marcus Henderson, or the man claiming to be Marcus Henderson, had hired him as a paid laborer. The arrangement was better than sharecropping, which most former slaves had been forced into after emancipation proved to be more legal fiction than practical reality. At least Tobias received actual wages, meager though they were, rather than being perpetually indebted to a landowner for seed, tools, and the very roof over his family's head. Still, it was hard, thankless work. The old plantation had fallen into considerable disrepair during and after the war. Sections of fencing had collapsed and rotted. The slave quarters, the term still used despite the circumstances having ostensibly changed, were crumbling structures that leaked when it rained. The main house itself, a once grand columned structure that had symbolized the wealth built on human suffering, now stood like a hollow monument to a fallen empire. Its paint had peeled away in long strips, revealing weathered wood beneath. Half the windows were boarded up, others simply gaped empty, their glass long since shattered. Henderson, a northern businessman who'd supposedly bought the property at auction, seemed more interested in the timber rights than in restoring any agricultural production. "What's got into you, old boy?" Tobias muttered, walking around to check Jasper's hooves for stones or injury. The mule was generally even-tempered, reliable in the way that made him valuable despite his age. This behavior was entirely out of character. That's when Tobias noticed the ground beneath the mule's front legs had a different texture than the surrounding soil. It looked disturbed, recently turned, though no one had worked this particular section in weeks, maybe longer. The earth here had a sunken quality, as if something beneath it had collapsed or settled. Tobias knelt down, his knees sinking slightly into the soft red clay, and pressed his palm against the earth. It felt wrong somehow. Hollow, as if there were empty space beneath the surface. A cool draft of air seemed to rise from the soil itself, carrying with it a smell that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Not the smell of death, he knew that smell too well from the war years, but something else. The smell of enclosed air, of spaces that had been sealed away from the world above. He stood quickly, an old fear tightening his chest like an iron band. He'd heard stories about this place from before the war, whispered accounts shared in the quarters after the overseers had retired for the night. The Henderson Plantation had been one of the largest in the county, with over 200 enslaved people at its peak, but it had also been one of the cruelest. Old-timers spoke of punishment cellars where people were locked away for days as discipline. They spoke of root cellars and storage spaces that had served darker purposes during the years of rebellion and escape attempts. They spoke of people who had simply disappeared, their names eventually forgotten, their fates never known. Tobias had dismissed such stories as exaggerations, the kind of dark mythology that grew around any place associated with suffering. But standing here now, Feeling that hollow space beneath his feet, those stories suddenly seemed less like mythology and more like buried history, trying to claw its way back to the surface. He should have walked away. Should have moved Jasper to a different section of the field and forgotten what he'd felt. That would have been the safe choice, the smart choice. But something made him call out to the other workers. Something made him insist they bring shovels. Samuel Johnson arrived first, a wiry man in his 40s who'd worked as a blacksmith before the war and now did whatever labor he could find. He was followed by two younger men, brothers named Daniel and Joseph Peters, both in their 20s and still adjusting to the strange reality of being paid, however poorly, for their work, rather than simply forced to do it under threat of violence. "What you got here, Tobias?" Samuel asked, eyeing the spot where Jasper still refused to stand. "I don't know," Tobias admitted, "but there's something under this ground, something hollow." The four men began to dig. The work was slow at first, the shovels biting into clay that had been packed down by years of rain and sun. But as they went deeper, 2 feet, then 3, the soil became looser, easier to move. It had been disturbed before, perhaps many times. 20 minutes later, the shovels struck wood. Not roots or buried timber from an old structure, but worked planks, deliberately placed, rotting and soft with age, but unmistakably intentional. "Lord have mercy," Samuel whispered, peering into the hole they'd created. Tobias used a crowbar to pry at the planks. They collapsed inward with a sound like breaking bones, revealing a larger darkness below. A space. A room carved into the earth beneath the field. The four men stood silent for a moment, staring down into that opening. The smell that rose from it was stronger now. Damp earth, rotting wood, stale air that hadn't been breathed in years. Or so they thought. Joseph, the younger of the Peters brothers, leaned closer to the edge. "Is that?" And that's when they heard it. A sound so faint they almost missed it under the buzz of cicadas in the surrounding trees and the whisper of wind through the tall grass that had grown up around the field's edges. A voice. Small, hoarse, barely human. "Help!" The word came from the darkness below, from the sealed space beneath the earth, from a throat that should have been silent with death, but somehow, impossibly, was not. "There's someone down there," Daniel shouted, and all four men immediately began tearing at the collapsed planks, widening the opening, letting more light fall into the space below. What they saw in that light made them doubt their own eyes. A child, a boy, perhaps 11 or 12 years old, lay curled in the corner of what appeared to be a small cellar. His dark skin was covered in red clay, his clothes torn and filthy. His lips were cracked and bleeding, split open from dehydration. His eyes squeezed shut against the sudden brightness, tears tracking lines through the dirt on his face. But he was alive. Against all reason, all possibility, he was alive. Tobias jumped down into the cellar without hesitation. It was perhaps 8 feet deep, and he landed hard on the packed earth floor, his ankles protesting the impact. Up close, the boy looked even worse, emaciated, trembling, his breathing shallow and rapid. But those eyes, when they finally opened and focused on Tobias's face, were sharp, alert. The eyes of someone who had fought to survive and won. "It's all right," Tobias said softly, reaching for the boy. "We've got you. You're safe now." The boy's mouth moved, trying to form words, but only a croak emerged. His hands, Tobias noticed with horror, were raw and bloody at the fingertips where he'd clawed at the wood above his head. The ceiling of the cellar showed fresh scratches, splinters of wood driven under the boy's nails in his desperate attempt to dig his way out. How long had he been down here? How long had he scratched at that unyielding wood, calling for help that didn't come? Samuel and the Peters brothers lowered a rope, and together they carefully lifted the boy up and out of his underground prison. When they laid him on the grass beside the hole, he curled into a ball, his body racked with tremors despite the afternoon heat that made the air shimmer above the fields. "Get water," Tobias ordered, slowly. "Not too much at once or it'll make him sick." Samuel ran for the well while Tobias knelt beside the boy, gently trying to assess his injuries without causing more pain. Dehydration, obviously. Malnutrition. The damaged hands. Bruises on his arms and legs. But miraculously, nothing appeared to be broken. Nothing that wouldn't heal with time and care. "Can you tell me your name?" Tobias asked gently. The boy's mouth moved again, and this time a whisper emerged, barely audible. "Thomas." "Thomas what?" "Hayes. Thomas Hayes." "How long have you been down there, Thomas?" The boy's eyes closed. His lips formed words that took several attempts to vocalize. "I lost count. Many days. So many days." Samuel returned with a bucket of water and a ladle. They let Thomas drink slowly, just small sips at first. The boy clutched the ladle with his damaged hands as if it were the most precious thing in the world. And perhaps in that moment, it was. "We need to get him to shelter," Joseph said. "And a doctor." But Henderson's property was 4 miles from the nearest town, and the nearest doctor, who would treat a colored child without demanding payment up front, payment that none of them had, was even farther than that. They'd have to make do on their own, at least for now. They carried Thomas to the sharecropper's cabin where Tobias lived with his wife, Ruth, and their 3 children. The cabin was small, just 2 rooms, but it was clean and sturdy, and Ruth had made it as much of a home as their circumstances allowed. Ruth Wright took one look at the boy in her husband's arms and immediately began issuing orders. "Bring him inside. Daniel, Joseph, go fetch more water from the well. Samuel, I need you to ride into town and see if Doc Ramsey will come out here. Tell him it's an emergency, a child near death. Don't take no for an answer." She cleared the table and they laid Thomas on it, and Ruth began the process of assessing his condition more thoroughly. She'd served as a nurse of sorts during the war, tending to the injured when the plantation's enslaved people were allowed no access to proper medical care. She'd learned through necessity and desperation, and while she had no formal training, she had experience and intuition. "Merciful God," she whispered, examining the abrasions on Thomas's hands and the bruises that covered his thin arms. "How long did you say he was down there?" "We don't know for certain," Tobias admitted. "But that ground hadn't been disturbed in weeks, maybe longer." Ruth looked at her husband, understanding dawning in her eyes. Understanding and disbelief, and a kind of horror that had nothing to do with the injuries she could see, and everything to do with what they implied. No one could survive 9 days without water. The human body simply couldn't do it. 3 days, perhaps 4 under extraordinary circumstances, but beyond that, dehydration would shut down the organs, poison the blood, stop the heart. It was biological fact. Without food, a person could survive weeks if they had water, but without water, impossible. Yet here was Thomas Hayes, thin and battered and barely conscious but breathing, his heart beating, his eyes focusing on her face when she spoke to him. "Thomas," she said gently, "can you hear me?" A slight nod. "I'm going to take care of you, understand? You're safe now. No one's going to hurt you." His mouth moved. She leaned closer to hear the words. "Thank you." Ruth set about the work of cleaning his wounds, giving him more water in small, measured amounts, and preparing a thin broth that his stomach might be able to handle after days of emptiness. Her 3 children, Emma, age 9, William, age 7, and little Sarah, just 5, watched from the corner with wide, frightened eyes. "Mama, is he going to die?" Emma asked in a small voice. "No, baby," Ruth said, though she wasn't entirely certain that was true. "He's going to be just fine. Now, I need you to be my helpers, understand? William, you fetch me clean cloths from the trunk. Emma, you mind your sister and keep her out of the way. Can you do that for me?" The children nodded and hurried to their tasks, grateful to have something to do besides stare at the broken boy on their table. Samuel returned an hour later with disappointing but not unexpected news. Doc Ramsey wouldn't come, not for a colored child, not without payment up front, and not without more information about how the injury had occurred. The doctor had been vague about his reasons, but Samuel understood the subtext. In 1871, 6 years after the war's end, the legal status of former slaves might have changed, but the social order remained largely intact. A black child found in mysterious circumstances on property owned by a white man was more likely to be seen as a problem than a victim worthy of medical attention. "We'll manage on our own," Ruth said firmly. "We always do." That first night, Thomas slept for 16 hours straight. Ruth checked on him every few hours, making sure he was still breathing, still alive, half expecting to find him cold and gone when she lifted the blanket to feel his pulse. But each time, his heart beat steadily beneath her fingers, weak but steady. When he finally woke the next morning, his voice had returned enough for him to speak in broken sentences. And the story he told, haltingly and with long pauses when the memories became too difficult, was both simple in its facts and impossible in its implications. Thomas Hayes had been alone in the world for longer than a child should be. His mother, a woman named Clara Hayes, who'd been enslaved on a plantation near Valdosta, had died of fever in the winter of 1869. Thomas had been 9 years old then, and his mother's death had left him with only his father, a man named Benjamin Hayes, who'd taken his wife's surname when they'd married in one of the freedmen's ceremonies that had become common after emancipation. Benjamin Hayes had been a field hand, strong and capable, but the years of slavery had left him with a deep bitterness that he'd tried to drown in whatever liquor he could find or trade for. After Clara died, that bitterness had consumed him entirely. He disappeared in the spring of 1870, and no one had seen or heard from him since. Some said he'd headed north, looking for work in the factories. Others whispered he'd been lynched for looking at a white woman wrong, his body left in an unmarked grave somewhere in the woods. Thomas had been left to fend for himself. At 10 years old, he'd done what countless other orphaned children did in the chaotic aftermath of the war. He'd found work wherever he could, taken shelter wherever it was offered, and learned to be invisible when invisibility meant survival. For the past year, he'd been working as a stable boy for a man named Cyrus Garrett, who owned a small farm about 15 miles south of the Henderson Plantation. Garrett wasn't a kind man, Thomas made that clear in his telling, but he wasn't as cruel as some. He paid a small wage, usually on time, and he didn't beat the boy unless Thomas made a serious mistake. By the standards of 1871 Georgia, that counted as decent treatment. The work was simple enough: feed the horses, clean the stalls, repair tack, and occasionally help with other farm chores when an extra pair of hands was needed. Thomas had been good at it, quiet and efficient, the kind of worker who went unnoticed and therefore unpunished. 9 days ago, or was it 10? Thomas had lost count in the darkness. Garrett had sent him on an errand. He was to deliver a message to someone at the old Henderson Plantation. Garrett had been specific about the instructions. Follow the main road until you see the brick pillars that mark the entrance. Then take the path through the cotton fields to the overseer's house on the eastern edge of the property. Thomas had set out in the early morning before the September heat became unbearable. He'd made the journey on foot, carrying the sealed envelope Garrett had given him in his pocket. The road had been familiar enough. He'd traveled it before on other errands, but the Henderson Plantation itself was new territory. He'd heard stories about the place, of course. Everyone had. But he'd never had reason to go there himself. The brick pillars at the entrance were still standing, though the iron gates that had once hung between them were long gone, probably sold for scrap during the war. The path through the fields was overgrown but still visible, a trail of packed earth winding between stands of cotton that had gone wild without cultivation, the bowls bursting open unpicked, white wisps floating on the breeze like ghosts. Thomas had followed the path, looking for the overseer's house, calling out occasionally to see if anyone would answer. But the house Garrett had described, a white-painted structure with a front porch and a cedar shake roof, didn't exist. At least not anymore. Thomas had found the ruins of something that might have once been that house, but it had burned down to its foundation, leaving only a chimney standing like a marker over a grave. He'd stood there confused, uncertain what to do. Return to Garrett, and report that there was no one to deliver the message to? Search the rest of the property to see if someone was working elsewhere? While he was deciding, he'd heard voices, men's voices, low and angry, coming from somewhere ahead through the tall grass and the overgrown kudzu that had claimed large sections of the abandoned fields. Thomas had been raised to understand that an unaccompanied black child had no business listening to white men's conversations. That was the kind of mistake that got you whipped, or worse. But curiosity and the instinct that told him this might be the person he was supposed to deliver the message to had made him creep closer, moving quietly through the vegetation. He'd parted the tall grass carefully, staying low, and seen two white men standing near what looked like an old cellar entrance. The entrance was half hidden by the undergrowth, easy to miss if you didn't know it was there. The wooden door that had once sealed it lay rotted and broken to one side. The men were dressed too well to be farmhands or day laborers. One was tall and lean, probably in his 40s, with dark hair that was graying at the temples. He wore a suit jacket despite the heat, and his boots were polished. The other was shorter and stockier, with a thick brown beard and suspenders over a white shirt. He held a leather satchel in one hand. They were arguing, their voices intense but controlled, the way men argue when they don't want to be overheard but can't contain their anger. Thomas had crouched behind a fallen tree trunk, perhaps 20 yards away, and listened. "Don't have that kind of time," the tall man was saying. "He's been asking questions, making inquiries with the county office." "Then we accelerate the timeline," the bearded man replied. "The debt is already arranged. Once the judge receives his payment, the sale will be final. Henderson won't have any legal ground to stand on. Henderson isn't going to accept it. You know that. He's already threatened to go to the federal authorities. Let him try. By the time any investigation begins, the property will have changed hands 3 times over. The paper trail will be impossible to follow. And if he talks before then, if he tells someone what he suspects, then we ensure he can't talk." The bearded man's voice had dropped to something cold and flat. "We've come too far to let one self-righteous heir ruin everything. The money we've invested, the arrangements we've made. This needs to conclude. Quickly." There was a pause. Then the tall man said, "I don't like it. I didn't sign on for that. You signed on for whatever was necessary. You knew that from the beginning, Price. Don't develop a conscience now." "Price." The tall man was named Price. Thomas had been so focused on the conversation that he hadn't noticed the dead branch partially hidden in the grass behind him. When he'd shifted his weight, his foot had come down on it with a crack that sounded, in the quiet field, as loud as a gunshot. Both men had turned instantly, their eyes scanning the area, landing on the spot where Thomas crouched behind the tree trunk. He'd frozen, hoping they hadn't seen him, hoping they'd dismiss the sound as an animal moving through the underbrush. But the bearded man had pointed directly at him. "There! Someone's watching us." Thomas hadn't waited to hear more. He'd bolted, running through the field with the kind of speed that only pure terror can produce. His bare feet had pounded against the hard clay, his breath burning in his lungs, his heart hammering so hard he'd thought it might burst from his chest. Behind him, he'd heard them crashing through the undergrowth, shouting. They were older, heavier, but they were also desperate, and that gave them speed they shouldn't have had. Thomas hadn't known the land. He'd run blindly, trying to find the path back to the road, back to something familiar. But the overgrown plantation was a maze of vegetation and collapsed structures and ditches hidden by tall grass. He'd stumbled, caught himself, kept running, and then he'd seen it. An old root cellar, its entrance partially collapsed, just a dark opening in the earth. Without thinking, driven purely by the instinct to hide, he'd scrambled down into it. The cellar had been larger than he'd expected, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, with walls of red clay supported by timber beams that had rotted through in places. It smelled of damp earth and decay. But it was dark, and it was hidden, and Thomas had thought if he could just stay quiet, the men would run past and give up the search. He'd crouched in the corner, controlling his breathing, listening to the footsteps above him on the ground. The men's voices calling out, searching, and then he'd heard something that had made his blood turn to ice. One of them, it sounded like the bearded man, had said, "Did you see which way he went?" "Toward the old storage cellars," Price had replied. "He couldn't have gone far. We need to find him." "Why? He's just a child. He probably didn't understand anything he heard." "We can't take that risk. We find him, and we make sure he stays quiet." There had been a pause, and then the bearded man had said, "Do you hear that?" Thomas had realized too late that his terrified breathing was audible in the enclosed space, echoing slightly. He'd clamped his hand over his mouth, but the damage was done. Footsteps had approached the cellar entrance above him. A shadow had fallen across the opening, blocking the light. "Well, well," the bearded man's voice had said from above. "Look what we have here." Thomas had pressed himself into the corner, but there was nowhere to go. The cellar had no other exit. He was trapped. Price's face had appeared in the opening, looking down. Their eyes had met, and Thomas had seen something in the man's expression. Conflict, perhaps. Guilt, but not enough to change what happened next. "What do we do with him?" Price had asked. "We buy ourselves time. Help me with these planks." Thomas had watched in horror as they'd begun dragging boards across the entrance, sealing him in. He'd scrambled up, trying to push the boards away, screaming for help, begging them to let him out. "I won't tell anyone," he'd shouted. "I promise." "I didn't hear nothing, please." But they'd kept working, and within minutes the entrance was completely sealed. The last thing Thomas had seen before darkness claimed the cellar entirely was a sliver of light that narrowed to a line, then to a point, then to nothing. He'd heard them above him, shoveling dirt, covering the boards, making sure no one would accidentally discover the sealed cellar or hear the cries of the boy trapped inside. And then the sounds had stopped, and Thomas had been alone in the complete and absolute darkness, buried alive beneath the earth. Thomas told his story slowly, over the course of 3 days, as his strength gradually returned. Ruth and Tobias didn't push him, didn't demand details when he needed to pause and collect himself. They let him speak at his own pace, and they listened with a growing sense of horror at what the boy had endured. The part of his story that no one could explain, the part that kept Ruth awake at night and made Tobias check and recheck the boy's condition, half convinced he was hallucinating and the boy would vanish like morning mist, was how Thomas had survived those 9 days. The first day had been the worst, Thomas said. The panic, the disbelief, the desperate certainty that this couldn't be happening. He'd screamed until his voice gave out, had thrown himself at the sealed entrance above him, clawing at the boards with his hands until his fingernails split and his fingertips bled. He'd searched every inch of the cellar in the darkness, running his hands along the clay walls, looking for a crack, a weakness, any possible way out. There was none. The cellar was a sealed tomb, and Thomas was going to die in it. By the second day, the panic had given way to a numb acceptance. His throat was raw from screaming. His hands were too damaged to claw anymore. He'd had no water, no food, and the air in the enclosed space was already starting to feel thick and stale. He'd curled up in the corner and waited for death, the way a wounded animal crawls into a dark place to die. But that's when things had started to change. Thomas struggled to describe it, and Ruth and Tobias struggled to understand what he was trying to tell them. It hadn't been a single dramatic moment, he explained, but rather a gradual awareness that he wasn't entirely alone in the darkness. He'd heard sounds, small ones at first, the kind that could be dismissed as the settling of old timbers or the scurrying of mice. But then he'd heard something that couldn't be dismissed as easily. A voice, or voices, faint, distant, as if they were coming from very far away or from behind a thick wall, whispering. Not words he could make out, just the cadence of human speech, rising and falling like conversation. "Are you sure it wasn't just your mind playing tricks?" Tobias had asked gently. "Sometimes when a person's that scared, that desperate, they can imagine things that seem real." But Thomas had shaken his head firmly. "It wasn't my imagination. I know what I heard, and I know what happened on the third day." The third day was when he should have died. 3 days without water is the limit for most humans. After that, the body begins to shut down rapidly. Dehydration leads to kidney failure, cardiovascular collapse, seizures. Death comes quickly. But on the third day, Thomas had heard something that had made him lift his head from where he'd been lying on the packed earth floor, barely conscious. The sound of water. Dripping water. He'd thought it was another hallucination at first, but the sound had been persistent, rhythmic. Drip, 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 coming from somewhere in the cellar. He'd crawled toward the sound, using his damaged hands to feel along the wall. And he'd found it. A place where water was seeping through the clay, gathering in small droplets that fell to the floor. Not much water, just a slow, steady drip. But it was water. Thomas had pressed his mouth to the wall and caught the droplets on his tongue one by one. It had taken hours to get enough to make a difference, but it had been enough. Enough to keep him alive for one more day. And then another. And another. The water saved you, Ruth had said, relief evident in her voice. An explanation, however improbable, was better than no explanation at all. But Tobias had his doubts. He'd returned to the cellar the day after they'd pulled Thomas out, wanting to examine it more carefully in the daylight. He'd brought Samuel and the Peters brothers with him, and they'd climbed down into the space with lanterns, checking every surface. There was no source of water. The walls were dry, hard-packed clay with no sign of moisture. There were no pipes, no underground spring, no crack in the earth that might have allowed water to seep through. The cellar was completely dry. Maybe it dried up after we opened it, Samuel had suggested. Air getting in changed things. In one day, Tobias had run his hand along the wall where Thomas had described finding the water. The clay there wasn't just dry, it was bone dry, cracked in places, the kind of dryness that takes months or years to develop, not hours. This hasn't been wet in a long time. They'd stood in the cellar, their lanterns casting shifting shadows on the walls, and tried to make sense of the impossible. Thomas should have died. By every law of nature and biology, he should have died. But he hadn't. Maybe the boy's mistaken about where the water was, Daniel had offered. Maybe he's confused about what happened down here. Trauma does that to the mind. Maybe, Tobias had said, but he hadn't believed it, because there was something else he'd found in that cellar. Something he hadn't mentioned to Thomas, hadn't mentioned to Ruth, and had only shown to the other men with a gesture that said, "Keep this quiet." In one corner of the cellar, partially hidden under accumulated dirt and debris, there were bones, old bones, weathered and brittle, some still partially articulated, others scattered. Human bones, not a complete skeleton, just pieces. A femur, ribs, a skull with a crack running through the temporal bone, the remains of at least one person, possibly more, who had been down here long before Thomas, and scratched into the wooden support beam nearest to those bones, carved with desperate fingers, or perhaps a nail or a piece of rock, were words: God, have mercy, help us, forgive, and dates, or what looked like dates, the numbers rough and partially illegible. 1864, March, 12 days. Someone had been imprisoned in this cellar during the war. Someone had scratched those words into the wood while they slowly died. And based on the multiple dates, on the plural us, it hadn't been just one person. This place had been used as a prison, a punishment cell, a place where enslaved people were locked away and forgotten, left to die in the darkness as an example to others. Tobias had stared at those scratches, those desperate pleas to a God who hadn't answered, and felt a cold certainty settle into his bones. Thomas hadn't been alone down here, not really. The boy might not have understood it, might not have been able to articulate it, but he'd been in the presence of something, someone, the dead who'd come before him. We bury these bones proper, Tobias had said quietly, and we don't tell the boy. He's been through enough without knowing he was sleeping on someone's grave. The other men had agreed, and they'd carefully gathered what remains they could find, wrapped them in burlap, and buried them in the far corner of the field, marked with a simple stone. No name, because they didn't know the name. No dates, because the dates scratched into the wood might have been accurate, or might have been the fevered calculations of a dying mind. Just a stone, a prayer, and the hope that whoever had died in that cellar had finally found peace. But the question remained, how had Thomas survived when they had not? Sheriff William Cook arrived at the Henderson property 5 days after Thomas's rescue. He was a thick-set man in his mid-50s, with a handlebar mustache that had gone gray and eyes that revealed nothing of what he might be thinking. He'd served as sheriff of Macon County for 12 years, having held the position through the war and its tumultuous aftermath. He was known as a pragmatic man, not particularly cruel but not particularly sympathetic either. He did his job, and his job was to maintain order, whatever that meant at any given moment. He arrived on horseback, accompanied by a deputy named Silas Finch, a younger man with nervous hands and a tendency to look at everything except the people he was talking to. They found Tobias and his family in the cabin, with Thomas sitting at the table eating the vegetable soup Ruth had prepared. The boy looked up when the sheriff entered, and Tobias saw something flicker across his face. Fear, recognition, calculation. The look of someone who'd learned early that men with authority were rarely on your side. "This the boy?" Sheriff Cook asked, not bothering with pleasantries. "This is Thomas Hayes," Ruth said, moving to stand protectively near the boy. "He's recovering from a terrible ordeal. So I've heard. Mind if I ask him some questions?" It wasn't really a question. The sheriff pulled out a chair and sat down without waiting for permission. He took a small notebook from his vest pocket and a pencil stub, licking the tip before poising it over a blank page. "Son, I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Start from the beginning." Thomas glanced at Tobias, who nodded encouragingly, then back at the sheriff. He repeated the story he'd told the Wrights, about being sent on an errand by Cyrus Garrett, about finding the 2 men arguing near the cellar, about being chased and trapped and sealed underground. Sheriff Cook wrote very little in his notebook. Mostly he just watched Thomas with those unreadable eyes, occasionally asking a clarifying question. "You say you were sent here by Cyrus Garrett? To deliver a message?" "Yes, sir." "What was the message?" "I don't know, sir. It was in a sealed envelope." "And do you still have this envelope?" "No, sir. I lost it when I was running." "Convenient." The sheriff tapped his pencil against the notebook. "And these 2 men you say trapped you in the cellar, can you describe them again?" Thomas described them as best he could remember. The tall man with graying hair. The shorter, stocky one with the thick brown beard, their fine clothes, the leather satchel. The argument about debts and timelines and someone named Henderson. "Did they give their names? Did you hear what they called each other?" Thomas hesitated, then nodded. One of them called the tall man Price. I heard him say it clear. Something flickered in the sheriff's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or concern. But it was gone so quickly Tobias almost thought he'd imagined it. "Price?" the sheriff repeated, writing it down. "You're certain?" "Yes, sir. I'm certain." The sheriff closed his notebook with a snap that seemed louder than it should have been in the small cabin. "Son, I spoke to Cyrus Garrett yesterday afternoon. He says he never sent you anywhere. Says he dismissed you from his service 2 weeks ago for stealing feed grain." "That's not true." Thomas's voice cracked with desperation and anger. "I never stole nothing. And I was there 9 days ago. I was working in the stables that morning before he sent me with the message. Mr. Garrett says otherwise, and Mr. Garrett is a respected member of this community, a landowner, a taxpayer." The sheriff's meaning was clear. Garrett's word mattered more than a black child's truth. Ruth's hand tightened on Thomas's shoulder. "Sheriff, this boy was buried alive. We pulled him from that cellar ourselves. Are you saying he somehow dug himself down there and sealed himself up? That he tore up his own hands and starved himself for 9 days just to... what? Get attention? I'm not saying anything except what I know, Mrs. Wright. And what I know is that I've got no evidence of any crime being committed." The sheriff stood, tucking his notebook back into his vest. The Henderson property has been abandoned for years. All kinds of vagrants and runaways have used it for shelter. Could be the boy fell into that cellar by accident while he was exploring or looking for food. Could be the entrance collapsed on top of him through natural causes. Could be a lot of things that don't involve two mysterious white men with no names and no evidence they ever existed. Except I heard one of them called Price. Thomas insisted. That's a name. Price is a common name, son. And even if you did hear it, that doesn't mean anything. Could have been anyone. Could have been your imagination. Tobias stepped forward, his voice carefully controlled despite the anger burning in his chest. Sheriff, we found bones in that cellar. Human bones, and writing on the walls, pleas for help, dates from during the war. That place was used to imprison people, to kill people. Doesn't that warrant some kind of investigation? For the first time, Sheriff Cook's expression shifted. He looked uncomfortable, like a man being forced to acknowledge something he'd rather pretend didn't exist. The war was a difficult time, he said finally. A lot of things happened that we're better off leaving in the past. Digging up old bones, literal or otherwise, doesn't help anyone move forward. You understand what I'm saying? The message was clear. The bones in the cellar, the victims of whatever atrocities had taken place on the Henderson plantation during slavery and the war, were not going to be investigated. Their deaths were going to remain officially unacknowledged, their suffering erased from any record that mattered. As for the boy's story, the sheriff continued, I'll make some inquiries, see if anyone matching those descriptions has been seen in the area. But I wouldn't get your hopes up. Without evidence, without witnesses, there's not much I can do. He headed for the door, then paused and turned back. One more thing, Mr. Wright. I'd advise you to keep the boy close. If his story is true, and I'm not saying it is, but if it is, then whoever put him in that cellar might not be pleased to learn he's still alive and talking. Might decide to finish what they started. The words hung in the air like a threat. Though whether the sheriff meant it as a warning or something else, Tobias couldn't tell. After Sheriff Cook and his deputy left, the cabin was silent for a long moment. Then Ruth pulled Thomas close, holding him tight, and said what they were all thinking. They're not going to help us. We're on our own. Thomas nodded against her shoulder. He'd known that already, had probably known it from the moment he'd been sealed in that cellar. In 1871, Georgia, a black child's word meant nothing against a white man's denial. Justice, if it came at all, would have to come from somewhere other than the law. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange kind of suspension, like the breath held before a blow falls. Thomas slowly regained his strength, his hands healed, and his voice returned fully. Ruth fed him every scrap of food she could spare, and the boy filled out a little, lost some of that haunted, hollow look that had made him seem more ghost than child. But he didn't speak much about what had happened. When the right children asked him questions, and they did constantly, with the morbid curiosity of the young, he'd deflect or change the subject. When Ruth tried to gently probe about the details of his 9 days underground, hoping to understand more about his survival, he'd go quiet, staring at nothing. Tobias noticed something else too, something that worried him more than the boy's silence. Thomas had trouble sleeping. Every night he'd wake multiple times, sitting bolt upright on his pallet with his eyes wide and his breath coming fast. Ruth would hear him and go to him, speaking softly, until the terror faded from his face and he lay back down. But even when he slept, it wasn't restful. He'd murmur in his sleep, having conversations with someone only he could hear, his voice too quiet for anyone to make out the words. And during the day, Thomas would sometimes stop in the middle of whatever he was doing, helping Tobias with chores, playing with the children, eating his meals, and his head would cock to one side as if he was listening to something. His eyes would go distant, unfocused. "You all right, son?" Tobias asked one afternoon when he caught Thomas standing motionless by the cabin window, staring out at nothing in particular. Thomas blinked, coming back to himself. "Yes, sir. Sorry, I thought I heard something." "Heard what?" "I don't know. Voices maybe, or wind, or..." He trailed off, shaking his head. "It's nothing. I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. Tobias could see it in the way the boy carried himself, in the way his eyes were always moving, scanning, searching for threats that might not even be there. Whatever Thomas had experienced in that cellar had left scars that went deeper than the ones on his hands. The real trouble started on a Tuesday night, 12 days after Thomas's rescue. Tobias woke to the sound of the cabin door creaking open. He sat up immediately, his hand reaching for the old hunting knife he kept by the bed, not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. In the moonlight coming through the window, he saw Thomas standing in the doorway, looking out into the night. "Thomas?" Tobias whispered, trying not to wake Ruth and the children. "What are you doing?" The boy didn't respond. He just stood there, perfectly still, staring into the darkness beyond the cabin. Tobias got out of bed and crossed to him quietly. When he reached the doorway and looked out, following the boy's gaze, he saw nothing. Just the fields, silvered by moonlight, and the dark line of trees in the distance. "Thomas," he said again, putting a hand on the boy's shoulder. Thomas jumped, startled, and looked up at Tobias with eyes that took a moment to focus. "Mr. Wright? I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. What are you doing out here, son?" "I heard." Thomas looked back out at the night. "I heard someone calling. I thought maybe someone needed help. There's no one out there. It's the middle of the night. But I heard them. I heard them as clear as I hear you now." The boy's voice was certain, not confused or doubtful. He genuinely believed what he was saying. Tobias guided Thomas back inside and closed the door, latching it securely. "Sometimes our minds play tricks on us when we're half asleep, especially after what you've been through. Try to get some rest, all right?" Thomas nodded, but as he lay back down on his pallet, Tobias saw him turn to face the door, his eyes open and alert, not sleeping, watching. The next night it happened again, and the night after that. Always the same. Thomas would wake and go to the door, drawn by voices only he could hear, calling to him from the darkness. Ruth tried talking to him about it during the day, asking if he remembered his dreams, if something specific was troubling him. But Thomas couldn't explain it. He just knew that when he slept, he'd hear them. The voices. Sometimes they sounded like whispers, sometimes like cries for help. And they came from the direction of the Henderson plantation. "They want me to come back," Thomas said finally, on the 5th night after it had started. He was sitting at the table with Ruth, the rest of the family asleep. "They want me to remember them." "Who wants you to remember them?" Thomas looked at her with eyes that seemed too old for his face. "The people who died there, in the cellars, in the fields. All the people who suffered and no one ever knew about it, or if they knew, they didn't care." Ruth felt a chill run down her spine. "Thomas, the people who died in that place are gone. They're at rest now." "Are they?" The boy's voice was quiet but intense. "How can they rest when no one remembers them? When their bones were buried in unmarked graves and their names were erased and it's like they never existed at all? We remember them. Mr. Wright and the other men who found those bones, they buried them proper. They said prayers." "That's not enough." Thomas's hands clenched into fists on the table. "Don't you understand? I was down there with them. I felt them keeping me alive, guiding me to the water, telling me not to give up. They saved me so I could tell their story, so someone would finally know what happened." Ruth didn't know what to say to that. How do you tell a traumatized child that the dead don't speak when that child is utterly convinced they do? How do you explain away a survival that shouldn't have been possible without acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, something beyond natural explanation had occurred? She settled for pulling Thomas into a hug and saying, "We know what happened. We know. And we'll remember. That's all we can do." But it wasn't all. Because 3 nights later, on a Saturday when the moon was dark and the night was thick with clouds, someone set fire to the old Henderson main house. The fire started around midnight, though no one knew the exact time. The first person to notice was Daniel Peters, who'd been walking home from a friend's house and saw the orange glow against the sky, visible even from 2 miles away. He'd run to the nearest occupied cabins, rousing people from sleep, and within 20 minutes, a dozen men had gathered at the burning house. But by then, it was far too late to do anything except watch. The Henderson mansion had been a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Years of neglect had left it dry as kindling, its wooden structure riddled with rot and gaps where weather had gotten in. The fire spread with terrifying speed, consuming the first floor in minutes, then roaring up through the second story, flames shooting out through broken windows and the partially collapsed roof. Tobias arrived with Samuel and found Thomas standing among the gathered crowd, staring at the inferno with an expression that was impossible to read. Terror, satisfaction, grief, maybe all of them at once. "How did this start?" Tobias asked Daniel. "Don't know. Could have been anything. Lightning, vagrants camping inside, spontaneous combustion from all that dry wood, or could have been deliberate." "Deliberate?" Tobias looked at him sharply. Daniel shrugged. "Place like this, with its history, plenty of folks would be happy to see it burn. Put the past in the ground where it belongs." They watched for hours as the fire consumed the mansion, reducing it to glowing embers and ash. The heat was intense even from 100 yards away, the flames reflecting in the faces of the watchers, casting everything in shades of orange and red and shadow. It was Samuel who first noticed the smell. "You smell that?" he asked, his nose wrinkling. "That ain't just wood burning." Tobias smelled it too. Something else in the smoke, something organic and sickly sweet, the smell of burning meat. "There's someone in there," Samuel said, horror dawning on his face. "Someone was in the house when it caught fire. They tried to get closer to see if there was any chance of rescue, but the heat drove them back. If someone was indeed in that house, they were beyond help now, beyond anything except a quick prayer and a slower death." When dawn came and the fire had finally burned itself out, leaving only the blackened skeleton of the mansion and piles of ash and debris, they went in to investigate. Moving carefully through the unstable ruins, stepping over fallen beams and around holes where the floor had collapsed into the basement, they found it in what had once been a study or office on the ground floor. A body, or what was left of one. The fire had been so intense that identification was impossible by sight. The corpse was charred beyond recognition, burned down to bone in places, the features obliterated. But it was definitely human, definitely adult, and definitely dead long before they'd found it. "Sweet Jesus," Samuel whispered, turning away. Deputy Finch arrived an hour later, summoned by one of the younger men who'd run to town. He examined the body with the dispassionate professionalism of someone who'd seen death before, then called for the doctor to come make an official determination. While they waited, some of the men continued searching through the ruins. That's when Tobias found the strongbox. It was in the corner of the burned study, partially buried under collapsed brickwork from the chimney. The box itself was made of heavy metal with a lock that had melted in the intense heat. Tobias used a piece of iron railing to pry it open, and inside, protected by the metal from the worst of the flames, were papers. Documents, contracts, deeds, and most significantly, a ledger. Its pages scorched at the edges, but still readable. Tobias began reading, and with each page his understanding of what had been happening on the Henderson plantation shifted into sharp, terrible focus. The ledger told a story of fraud, corruption, and murder, or at least of plans for murder. The Henderson plantation hadn't been sold to any northern businessman named Marcus Henderson after the war. That was a fiction, a fabrication created by a lawyer named Jonathan Price and his business associate Martin Chambers. The real heir to the property was a man named Robert Henderson, the nephew of the plantation's original owner, who'd been serving in the Confederate Army when his uncle died in 1863. Robert Henderson had returned after the war to claim his inheritance, only to discover that the property had supposedly been sold to pay war debts. Debts that, according to the documents in the ledger, had never actually existed. The sale had been arranged through forged documents, falsified signatures, and the cooperation of corrupt officials who'd been paid handsomely for their assistance. But Robert Henderson wasn't accepting it. According to correspondence recorded in the ledger, he'd been fighting the sale in court, gathering evidence, preparing to take his case to federal authorities. He'd been convinced that if he could prove the fraud, he could reclaim his family's land. Price and Chambers had been growing increasingly desperate. The ledger detailed payments made to various individuals, a judge, a county clerk, a lawyer in Atlanta, who'd agreed to lose certain documents that might prove problematic. It detailed the substantial debts they'd incurred to make these arrangements work, and it detailed their discussions about the Henderson problem and how to resolve it permanently. The most damning entry was dated September 3rd, 1871, 3 days before Thomas had been sent on his errand to the plantation. Meeting with Chambers at the old storage cellars, discussed final payment to Judge Morrison and timeline for completing the sale. Our Henderson continues to be an obstacle. Chambers suggests more direct solution. I expressed reservations but acknowledge we may have no choice if legal channels fail. Matter must be concluded by month's end, or our creditors will demand repayment we cannot provide. The entry for September 6th, the day Thomas had been trapped, was brief. Incident at the property. Unforeseen complication. Chambers handled it. Hope we have bought sufficient time. Tobias read these entries multiple times, trying to absorb their implications. Thomas hadn't imagined anything. He'd witnessed exactly what he said he'd witnessed. 2 men involved in a criminal conspiracy, discussing how to eliminate someone who threatened their fraud. And when Thomas had overheard that conversation, they'd tried to eliminate him too. He showed the ledger to Samuel and Daniel, and they read it with mounting anger and disgust. This was the reality of 1871, of the South's attempt to reconstruct itself after the war. Old power structures finding new ways to maintain control, new opportunists exploiting the chaos for profit, and the law itself being bought and sold like any other commodity. When Sheriff Cook arrived later that afternoon, Tobias handed him the ledger without a word. The sheriff read it, his expression giving nothing away, then closed it and looked at Tobias. "Where did you find this?" "In the ruins, in a metal box in what was left of the study." "And the body?" "Still where we found it. Doc Ramsey is examining it now." Sheriff Cook was silent for a long moment, looking out at the smoldering ruins of the mansion. Finally, he said, "Jonathan Price is a respected lawyer in this county. He's handled legal matters for some of our most prominent citizens. Accusations like this aren't accusations," Tobias interrupted. "It's his own writing, his own records. And that boy in my cabin told you the truth. He heard Price talking about fraud and murder, and they tried to silence him for it. The boy said he heard someone called Price. That could be anyone. How many lawyers named Price are there in Macon County?" The sheriff didn't answer that. Instead, he tucked the ledger under his arm and said, "I'll look into this, quietly. If what's in here is true, then we've got a serious problem. But if it's not, if this is some kind of forgery or misunderstanding, then making accusations against a man like Jonathan Price could cause all kinds of trouble." "And what about Thomas Hayes?" Tobias demanded. "What about the fact that he was nearly killed because he overheard something he shouldn't have?" "I'll look into it," the sheriff repeated. "That's all I can promise." But his eyes, when they met Tobias's, carried a different message. "This is bigger than you understand. This involves people with power and connections. Tread carefully." After the sheriff left, Tobias returned to the cabin and told Ruth and Thomas what he'd found. Thomas listened with an expression of vindication mixed with fear. "So I was right," the boy said quietly. "They were planning to kill someone, and they tried to kill me because I heard them." "Looks that way," Tobias confirmed. "But now we have proof. The sheriff can't ignore this." "Can't he?" Ruth's voice was bitter. "You heard him. He's already looking for ways to protect Price. Men like that always protect each other." She was right, and Tobias knew it. But he also knew that the ledger and the documents in that strongbox were evidence that couldn't be completely ignored or buried. Too many people had seen them. Too many people knew about them now. Something would have to happen. The question was what? and whether justice would actually be served or merely the appearance of justice. The body found in the burned mansion was identified 3 days later through a combination of dental records, a distinctive ring that had survived the fire, and a broken bone in the left leg that the victim had suffered in childhood. It was Robert Henderson. The real heir to the Henderson plantation had been dead when the fire started. The preliminary medical examination suggested he'd been dead for several days, possibly as long as a week. Cause of death was difficult to determine given the condition of the body, but there were indications of trauma to the back of the skull, consistent with a blow from a heavy object. Murder, then. And the fire had been set to cover it up, to destroy evidence, to make identification difficult or impossible. The revelation sent shockwaves through Macon County. Robert Henderson had been a known figure, a man who'd been openly fighting to reclaim his family property. People had seen him in town, had spoken with him, had heard his accusations of fraud. His disappearance hadn't been widely noticed. He'd been living in Atlanta while pursuing his legal case, but now that his body had been found, questions were being asked. Sheriff Cook could no longer handle the matter quietly. Federal authorities were called in. U.S. Marshals arrived to take over the investigation. Suddenly, what had been a local problem involving a disputed property became a case of murder and fraud that had implications reaching far beyond Macon County. Jonathan Price was brought in for questioning. He arrived with his own lawyer, maintained his innocence, and claimed the ledger was either a forgery or had been misinterpreted. He admitted to handling legal matters related to the Henderson property, but insisted everything had been legitimate. He denied knowing Robert Henderson personally, denied any meetings at the old cellars, denied any involvement in the man's death. "And what about the boy?" the federal marshal asked, according to the account Tobias later heard from someone who'd been present. "What about Thomas Hayes, who says he overheard you discussing fraud and murder?" "I don't know any Thomas Hayes," Price had replied. "I've never met him. The child is either mistaken or lying." But Price's associate, Martin Chambers, proved to be the weaker link. Chambers was arrested 2 days after Price, found trying to board a train in Atlanta with a substantial amount of cash and falsified travel documents. When confronted with the evidence, the ledger, Thomas's testimony, the fraudulent deeds, he broke down and confessed everything. Yes, he and Price had engineered the fraudulent sale of the Henderson property. Yes, they'd bribed officials and forged documents. Yes, they'd been meeting at the old cellars to discuss how to handle Robert Henderson's legal challenge. And yes, he'd seen Thomas Hayes that day. A colored boy who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, who'd heard too much. Chambers admitted to chasing the boy, to trapping him in the cellar, to sealing him in and covering the entrance with dirt. "I thought he'd die quickly," Chambers said, according to the marshal's report. 2 days, maybe 3. "I thought it would be over fast, and no one would ever know. I thought I was just buying time, silencing a potential witness." "You tried to murder a child," the marshal had said flatly. "I never touched him. I just locked him away. I didn't think." But what Chambers hadn't confessed to, what he adamantly denied, was killing Robert Henderson. He admitted to the fraud, admitted to sealing Thomas in the cellar, admitted to setting the fire to destroy evidence when he'd learned the boy had somehow survived. But he swore he'd had nothing to do with Henderson's death. "That was Price," Chambers insisted. "I didn't want any part of it. I told him we should just let the legal process play out, pay whatever we had to pay, take whatever losses we had to take. But Price said we'd gone too far, invested too much. He said Henderson had to be dealt with." "Did you see Price kill Henderson?" "No. But Price told me it was done, told me the problem was resolved. That was 3 days before the boy showed up. And then, when the boy survived, when we heard he'd been pulled out of that cellar alive, Price panicked. Said we had to destroy everything, had to get rid of any evidence that might connect us. That's when he set the fire." Price, confronted with his associate's testimony, maintained his innocence. But the evidence was overwhelming. The ledger in his handwriting, the forged documents, Thomas's testimony about overhearing a man named Price, Chambers's confession. The trial began in the spring of 1872, 8 months after Thomas had been pulled from the ground. It lasted 3 weeks and was one of the most sensational cases the county had ever seen. People came from surrounding counties to watch, cramming into the courthouse, standing in the aisles, pressing against the windows to peer in. Thomas was called to testify. Tobias and Ruth sat with him in the witness stand, providing moral support as the boy recounted his story in front of a courtroom full of white faces, many of them hostile, many skeptical, many simply curious to see the child who'd survived 9 days buried alive. He spoke clearly, despite his fear. He described the argument he'd overheard, the chase, the terror of being sealed in the darkness. He pointed at Price and Chambers when asked to identify them. "Those are the men who put me in the cellar," he said, his voice steady. "Those are the men who tried to kill me." The defense lawyer tried to discredit him, suggesting he was confused, that he couldn't have seen the men clearly, that his memory might be faulty after such trauma. But Thomas didn't waver. "I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And I know they tried to bury me alive because I knew too much." In the end, the jury, all white men, as was required by law, returned a verdict. Guilty on charges of fraud and conspiracy. Guilty on charges of attempted murder of a minor. Jonathan Price was sentenced to 20 years in the state penitentiary. Martin Chambers received the same. The murder charge related to Robert Henderson was more complicated. There wasn't enough direct evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Price had killed him, despite Chambers's testimony. The fire had destroyed too much. The defense argued that someone else could have killed Henderson, that the death might have been unrelated to the fraud case. In the end, the judge ruled that while the circumstances were highly suspicious, the prosecution hadn't met its burden of proof on the murder charge. Price and Chambers would be imprisoned for the crimes they could be proven to have committed, but Robert Henderson's death would remain, officially, unsolved. It wasn't perfect justice. But in 1872, Georgia, it was more justice than most people expected a black child to receive. Thomas Hayes stayed with Tobias and Ruth Wright for 2 years after the trial. They formally took him in, gave him their name. Thomas Wright he became, though he always remembered his mother's name of Hayes and would eventually reclaim it, and raised him as one of their own. The experience of those 9 days in the darkness never left him entirely. He still had nightmares, still woke sometimes in the middle of the night with his heart pounding and his skin slick with sweat. But gradually, with time and the steady love of the Wright family, he began to heal. He learned to read under Ruth's patient instruction, sitting at the kitchen table with Emma and William and Sarah, all of them laboriously working through the few books the family owned. He learned the skills of farming from Tobias, though he never fully lost his fear of the earth, never fully trusted the ground beneath his feet. He grew taller, stronger, filled out with regular meals and hard work, and he learned to live with the knowledge of what he'd survived, and why. Sometimes late at night, Ruth would hear him talking in his sleep. He'd be having a conversation with someone, though his words were too quiet to make out clearly. When she asked him about it in the morning, he'd say he didn't remember his dreams. But once, only once, he spoke of it directly. It was a rainy afternoon in November 1873, 2 years after his rescue. Thomas was 13 now, taller and stronger, his voice beginning to change with the approach of manhood, but he still carried that peculiar intensity in his eyes, that quality of someone who'd seen things most people never see and lived to remember them. He and Tobias were repairing a fence line when the boy suddenly stopped working and looked at the ground. "It wasn't empty down there," Thomas said quietly. Tobias looked up from the post he was setting, his hand stilling on the hammer. "What wasn't empty?" "The cellar. When I was trapped. It wasn't empty. There were others." A chill ran down Tobias's spine despite the humid air. "Others? What do you mean, others?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his hands gripping the fence rail, his knuckles pale against his dark skin. When he spoke, his voice was calm, matter of fact. the voice of someone recounting simple truth rather than something impossible. In the dark, after the first day when I thought I was going to die, I heard them. Voices, whispers. People who'd been down there before me, people who didn't get out. Thomas, they showed me where the water was dripping. The boy's eyes were distant now, looking at something Tobias couldn't see. Even though you didn't find any water when you went back, I know what I experienced. They told me where to put my mouth against the wall. They told me to drink slowly, to make it last. They told me to stay still, to conserve my strength, not to waste energy fighting when fighting wouldn't help. He paused, and when he continued, his voice was softer. They kept me company, Mr. Wright. In the darkness, when I was so scared I thought my heart would stop, they talked to me, told me I wasn't alone. Told me stories about their lives, about the people they'd loved, about the things they'd hoped to do if they ever got free. They kept me sane. And when I heard Jasper stomping above me on that 9th day, when I heard you all digging, they told me to call out. Told me to use the last of my strength to make myself heard. They told me I was going to be saved. Tobias wanted to say it was impossible, wanted to explain it as fever dreams or hallucinations brought on by dehydration and terror. But he'd seen the cellar. He'd seen those desperate scratches on the walls, those pleas for mercy from people who died down there in the darkness. He'd found and buried the bones, and he'd never been able to explain the water. Thomas had been so certain about it, so detailed in his description of where it had dripped, how it had tasted, how he'd positioned himself to catch the drops. Yet when they'd gone back, the walls had been bone dry, with no sign that moisture had been there recently. Did they tell you their names? Tobias asked finally, his voice rough. Thomas shook his head. They didn't have names anymore. They'd been forgotten so long that their names had faded away. They were just voices, memories, echoes of people who used to be. He looked up at Tobias then, and his eyes were clear and direct. But they helped me live. They made sure I didn't give up. They saved me, so someone would finally know they'd been there. So someone would finally tell their story, and they wouldn't just be forgotten bones in an unmarked grave. We buried them proper, Tobias said quietly, with prayers, and people know about them now because of what happened, because of you. I know, and I think that's why they're quiet now, why I don't hear them anymore. Thomas smiled slightly sadly. They found what they needed. Someone to remember them, someone to make sure their suffering wasn't erased from history. He turned back to the fence, picked up his tools and resumed working. And Tobias, after a moment, did the same. They never spoke of it again. By 1875, Thomas was 15 and ready to make his own way in the world. The Wright family had given him everything: love, education, a sense of belonging. But he felt the pull to move on, to see what lay beyond Macon County and its dark memories. Tobias helped him secure a position with a railroad company that was expanding through Georgia, laying track toward the coast. Thomas left with promises to write, to visit, to never forget what they'd done for him. He kept those promises. Letters arrived regularly over the years, describing his work, his travels, the new people he met. The railroad took him west, through Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana, and eventually into Texas. He worked hard, saved his money, and learned skills that made him valuable. He became a surveyor's assistant, then a crew foreman, eventually rising to a position of real responsibility despite the color barriers that remained in place throughout the South. In Texas, he met a woman named Elizabeth Carter, a school teacher in a small town outside San Antonio. They married in 1882, when Thomas was 24, and started a family. Children came, 4 of them over the years, and Thomas built the life his mother had hoped for him, the life that had seemed impossible during those dark days of slavery and its violent aftermath. He never returned to Georgia, though. In his letters, he never mentioned the Henderson Plantation, never spoke of the 9 days he'd spent buried beneath its fields. It was as if that chapter of his life existed in a separate world, one he'd sealed away as surely as he'd been sealed away from the world above. But he never forgot. and he made sure his children knew the importance of remembering the past, of honoring those who'd suffered, of bearing witness to injustice even when that witness was uncomfortable or unwelcome. Your history matters, he'd tell them, not just the history in books, but the history of people who never made it into books. The people who were forgotten, whose names were erased, whose stories were buried. They matter, and it's our job to remember them. Tobias Wright died in 1889, at the age of 62, his body worn out from decades of hard labor. The funeral was held on a warm Sunday afternoon, with most of the black community in the county attending. Tobias had been a respected man, known for his fairness, his quiet strength, and his willingness to stand up for what was right, even when it was dangerous. At the funeral, a man arrived that none of the Wright children immediately recognized. He was tall and well-dressed, with the bearing of someone who'd found success in life. He wore a good suit, carried himself with confidence, and had kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. It was Thomas, now 31 years old, returned from Texas to pay his respects to the man who'd saved his life. He stayed for a week, helping Ruth sort through Tobias's belongings, sharing stories with the Wright children, now grown adults with families of their own, and simply being present in the way that family is present during grief. On his last evening there, he asked Ruth to walk with him. She agreed, curious about what he wanted to say that couldn't be said in the cabin with everyone else present. They walked in silence for a while, following familiar paths through fields that had changed hands several times since the Henderson property had been broken up and sold in parcels. The old main house was long gone, of course, just a foundation covered in kudzu and wild grass. But the cellar was still there, though someone had filled it in with earth and planted over it. Thomas stood at the spot where he'd been pulled from the ground and was silent for a long time. Ruth waited patiently, understanding that he needed this moment, whatever it was. Finally, Thomas spoke. "I owe him everything," he said, meaning Tobias. He didn't have to dig that day. He could have ignored what Jasper was telling him, could have moved the mule to another field and kept working. Most men would have. It was safer, easier. He was a good man, Ruth said simply. He did what was right. "Do you think they found peace?" Thomas asked suddenly. "The people who were down there before me, the ones who didn't survive?" Ruth looked at him carefully. Over the years she'd thought about that day, about Thomas's survival, about all the things that hadn't made sense. She'd never fully decided what she believed about the water that apparently didn't exist, about the voices Thomas claimed to have heard. "Do you still believe they were there?" she asked. "That it wasn't just your mind trying to cope with an impossible situation?" Thomas didn't answer right away. He knelt down and placed his palm against the earth, the same gesture Tobias had made all those years ago when Jasper had refused to move. "I know what I experienced," he said quietly. "I know I should have died down there. By all logic, by all laws of nature and biology, I should have died. 3 days without water kills a person. Everyone knows that. But I was down there for 9 days, Mrs. Wright. 9 days." He stood up, brushing the red clay from his hand, and looked at her directly. "Something kept me alive. Whether it was God, or the spirits of people who'd suffered in that place, or just the simple, stubborn refusal of my body to give up. I'll never know for certain. Maybe it was all of those things. Maybe it was none of them, and I just got impossibly lucky." He paused, then continued. "But I've spent every day since then trying to live in a way that honors it. Whatever it was that saved me, I owe it my life. So I live it well. I live it fully. I make it count. I raise my children to be good people. I help others when I can. And I make sure people remember that history didn't just happen to important folks in big houses. It happened to ordinary people, suffering people, people whose names nobody wrote down but who mattered just as much." Ruth pulled him into a hug then. This boy who'd become a man, this survivor who'd transformed his trauma into purpose. "They'd be proud," she whispered. "All of them, wherever they are." Tobias, and those people from the cellar, and your mama, who I never met but who raised a strong son. They'd all be proud of the man you've become. They stood there together as the sun set over the fields, casting long shadows across the Georgia soil that had witnessed so much suffering and somehow occasionally produced moments of grace. Thomas Hayes lived until 1934, dying at the age of 76 in his home in San Antonio, Texas, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who loved him. He'd lived a full life, a good life by any measure. He'd prospered, despite the obstacles placed in his path, had raised a family, had contributed to his community. His obituary in the San Antonio newspaper made no mention of the Henderson Plantation, the 9 days he'd spent buried beneath its fields, or the trial that had brought a small measure of justice to Macon County, Georgia. It simply stated that he'd been a railroad man, a devoted husband and father, and a pillar of his community. A life reduced to basic facts, as all lives eventually are in newspapers and public records. But among his personal effects, his family found a letter, sealed and marked, "To be opened after my death." In it, Thomas had written out the full account of his ordeal, every detail he could remember, including the parts he'd never told anyone except Tobias Wright. He wrote about the voices in the darkness, about the cool hand that seemed to guide his own to the source of water that shouldn't have existed, about the whispered encouragements that kept him from succumbing to despair, about the feeling of not being alone, even in the deepest darkness. And he wrote about the promise he'd made in that cellar, in the depths of his fear and suffering. "If I survive this," he'd whispered into the darkness, "I will make sure people know you were here. I will make sure your stories are told. You won't be forgotten. I swear it." The letter ended with a simple instruction: "Bury this account with me, so that it goes into the earth just as I once did. Let it rest there with the stories it contains. Let that be enough." His family honored his wish. The letter was placed in his casket, and Thomas Hayes was laid to rest in a cemetery in San Antonio beneath a simple headstone that bore his name and dates, and the inscription, "He lived well." Meanwhile, in Georgia, the Henderson plantation land continued its slow transformation. In the 1950s, the remaining parcels were sold for residential development. Houses were built over the old fields, paved roads replaced the dirt paths, and new families moved in with no knowledge of what had happened there decades before. The developers filled in the old cellar completely, poured a concrete foundation over it, and built a modest ranch house on the spot. A young couple bought it in 1958, attracted by the affordable price and the quiet neighborhood. They raised 3 children there, planted a garden, added a patio. It was a normal house on a normal street, with nothing to suggest its history. But the residents of that house and the houses nearby sometimes reported strange things. The sound of water dripping in basements when there were no pipes overhead and no visible source. A feeling of hollowness beneath their feet when they walked in certain spots, as if the ground wasn't quite solid. Voices carried on the wind at night, too faint to make out words, but unmistakably human. And sometimes when the ground was soft after a rain, they'd find indentations in their yards, as if the earth was settling, as if there were spaces beneath the surface that wanted to be found. No one investigated. No one dug. Because by then, the stories had faded into local folklore, the kind of thing people mentioned half-jokingly at neighborhood barbecues. "Oh, this land used to be a plantation. Supposedly haunted, but aren't they all?" The bones that Tobias Wright and the other men had buried in 1871 still rested in an unmarked spot in what was now someone's backyard, their location forgotten. The names of the people who died in that cellar, the details of their suffering, the circumstances of their deaths, all forgotten. Erased from official history if they'd ever been included in it at all. But the ground remembers. That's what people don't understand. The earth holds on to things, keeps records in its own way. Blood soaked into soil doesn't disappear. Bones buried deep don't cease to exist. Suffering leaves marks that persist long after the suffering has ended. And sometimes in places where the suffering was especially intense, especially prolonged, those marks become more than just memories. They become presences, echoes of people who were denied justice, denied recognition, denied even the basic dignity of being remembered. Were those voices Thomas heard real? Did the dead truly guide him to water, keep him alive, give him the strength to survive? Or was it all in his mind, the desperate hallucinations of a dying brain trying to maintain hope in impossible circumstances? The question can never be fully answered. Thomas believed what he believed, lived his life according to that belief, and found meaning in an experience that should have killed him. And in the end, maybe that's what matters. Not whether the voices were literally real, but whether Thomas's survival served a purpose. Whether his testimony brought some measure of justice to a corrupt system. Whether his life honored the memory of people who'd suffered and died in that place. He kept his promise. He made sure people knew. For a little while at least, the forgotten were remembered. That may not seem like much, but to those who died unknown and unmarked, maybe it was everything. The Henderson Plantation is gone now, transformed into suburban houses and sidewalks and carefully mowed lawns. The people who live there go about their normal lives, unaware of the history beneath their feet. They sleep peacefully in their beds, raise their children, plant their gardens, and never think about what happened there more than a century ago. And that's probably how it should be. Life moves forward. The past can't be allowed to paralyze the present. But on certain nights, when the wind is right and the moon is dark, if you stand in just the right spot where the old cellar used to be, you might hear something. A whisper, a sigh, the faint sound of someone calling for help. It's probably just the wind, just the settling of old structures beneath the ground, just the ordinary sounds of earth and air and time passing. Probably. But then again, maybe not. Maybe the ground still remembers. Maybe it always will. And maybe, somewhere in the darkness beneath the surface, voices are still whispering, still telling their stories, still waiting for someone to listen. Thomas Hayes listened. He heard them. He survived because of them, or at least he believed he did. And he made sure for as long as he could that they weren't forgotten. That's his legacy. Not the successful career, not the family he raised, not the years he lived or the money he earned. His legacy is that he bore witness, he remembered, he told the story, and now you know it too. The boy who survived 9 days buried beneath a plantation. The child who should have died, but didn't. The voice that spoke for those who'd been silenced. His story is finished now, told and recorded and passed on. But the stories of those who didn't survive, those are still there, still waiting, still hoping someone will remember. The ground knows. The earth holds their secrets. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear them too.